The next session that we're going to be doing is around commercialization in health tech. And we've got some people who have experienced commercialization within health technology, both sharing and discussing in this panel conversation in different capacities. So I'll introduce firstly Robert, who is joining us, who's going to be chairing the session. How are you, Robert?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
Really good, thank you. Robert's a member of THG Plus, is within the community, very active in there, and a good person to share a conversation with. Actually, I realized everyone within this panel conversation that we're going to be doing, including yourself, Richard, has been on the podcast at some point. So it's a good follow-on from that, and everyone at least has experienced my zaniness once before. For those that don't know Robert, he's the co-founder and CEO of Cognium. Cognium help organizations to empower them to discover new truths in the collection and analysis of their data. They make the Tandem Suite, which is bridging understanding of executives and frontline staff with that information for better outcomes for clients, staff, and businesses alike. He's worked at Cerner for 12 years before that, and has created lots of automations and improvements to save loads of money. So on the panel that I'll let you introduce and speak to in a second, Robert, is Sam Lanyon, Bronwyn, LeGrice, and Dr. Marcus Tan, who's all on the screen now. And over to you to have this conversation around commercialization in health tech.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and it's my pleasure to introduce a couple of people. Sam Lanyon, he's the CEO and co-founder of Planet Innovation. He's been doing innovative and strategic business leadership with a lot of experience in strategy, sales, operations, and has a huge track record with rolling out commercialized solutions globally. So he's also the executive chair of Lumos Diagnostics, non-executive chair of Paragon Funds Management, and has a lot of degrees in engineering and all kinds of stuff. So,
and can I just say in my bio, I don't generally use the word huge, so I think there's a bit of artistic license there, Robert.
We also have Marcus Tan. Thanks for joining us. He's also a CEO, co-founder of Health Engine. So it's the largest online consumer healthcare network in Australia. He's an experienced GP. He's done executive and boards for over 20 years in the clinical space. And he's also in several different company directorships with the Australian Institute of Management and a couple other major facilities. So welcome to the stage. We're happy to have you join us.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
And finally, last but not least, we have Bronwyn LeGrice. I think I'm saying your name right. She is pretty much one of the few people I've always seen on stage, and probably doesn't need the introduction, but with over 18 years of experience, she's run the N Health Network Accelerator. She's led a lot of really significant growth in the Australian healthcare industry by creating over 225 jobs and more than 140,000 patents in the last 3 years. So she's also a director of Lumos Diagnostics.
It's not patents, patients.
Patients, sorry, patients.
That's a lot of patents.
That's but yeah, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you guys here. Today we're going to be talking really quickly. We got about 30 minutes to talk over commercializing healthcare solutions. So Bronwyn, we're going to start with you. We've gotten a couple questions. How do you take some of the innovative ideas that you've seen and transfer them to viable commercial offerings in the healthcare market? And particularly, have you seen any common patterns of success with companies that have come from Ant Health?
Sure. So I think the first thing is, and Marcus can probably talk to this as well, as will Sam, is one of the things you really need to think about is whether there's an unmet need. And it's not just an unmet clinical need, but is there an unmet market need? So is there a economic driver, or is there a friction point that can be solved with technology that can impact patients, but also solve problems for other players in the healthcare system? In terms of the consistent challenges we see, it's often not around clinical validation or even product development or any of those things. It's actually around business model design. So healthcare is extremely complex. It's even more complex if you want to go into multiple countries, such as the US, or the UK, which have different systems to us. And so if you're looking at how you you can have the world's best technology that helps millions of patients, but you still have to find a way to be paid for it. And so navigating those extremely complex, highly layered healthcare systems to find a paying customer that has an incentive to pay for it can be the kind of difference between success and failure. And we've seen some massive companies fail. So we've seen Driver, which attracted $90 million of investment. It failed 6 weeks after launch. Seen Proteus, which is probably one of the most well-known digital health companies, into Chapter 11 and end up with its assets fire sale to its pharma partner. You know, a lot of this comes down to knowing who your payer is going to be, and not just assuming that because of a technology that works that will save the healthcare system millions, that someone will automatically pay for it, because it just doesn't happen.
Right. Okay. Follow-up points, Dr. Marcus or Sam?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to jump in here. So look, clearly Bronwyn understands and has expressed the points, and I'll probably just reiterate in a slightly different way. I think a lot of people are probably enamored too much with the cleverness and novelty aspects of their innovative ideas. So, like, you know, very much too focused on the product and not necessarily the solution, and not necessarily worried about the problem that they're trying to solve. And this idea of viability, which is actually the sort of crux of what we're talking about in terms of commercialization, is actually about focusing a lot more on understanding the market rather than the product. And the business models that are associated with the viability of it is effectively around 2 points. So around the adoption curve. So, being able to understand how your market adoption is going to occur and what that crossing the chasm aspect is important. And then the second part is around the competitive market dynamics over time. So, like, it's great to have this innovative idea that no one's ever thought of before and trying to sell into a market. But once it's actually in, there's going to be a whole bunch of people, coming in that will think that, this is an idea that they can disrupt as well. I guess to the extent that we're talking about steps of how you reach that viability, it is about understanding your customer and the problems you're trying to solve. But it is also about demonstrating value over time and pricing sustainably. I think we'll talk about pricing later on in this conversation.
Sure, absolutely. Sam, any other points?
Oh.
Robert,
there we go. I think we lost you there.
I've got some bandwidth. I think I've got some bandwidth
issues. That's all right. We'll give it a second. We'll come back. We'll see if we can circle back to you. Dr. Marcus, next one for you. What are some of the things early stage founders should be probably thinking about when it comes to pricing their digital health solutions to different parts of the healthcare system?
Yeah, look, pricing is we could spend the entire summit talking about pricing. It's just such a complicated thing, and there's probably an art and a science associated with pricing that you probably need to consider. But it's mostly around life cycle and what you're trying to do. So I'll probably just sort of crystallize the 3 main points around pricing. The first one around how you might determine pricing is just looking at just the value exchange. So depending on who's paying or subsidizing for the solution, you need to be able to work out, look, what are you delivering to them and how much are they willing to pay, for that value. So understanding that. The second one is obviously around, the substitutes and competitive environment that you're in. So, interestingly, a lot of people tend to favor tech. We're all technologists. We all love tech. But sometimes the cheapest and most easy solution is the pen and paper, right? I hate to say it, right? But people try to overbuild stuff for a problem that isn't really that big of a problem. So understanding that you're actually sometimes pricing against something that's very simple and very cheap. And the last thing is that, you need to, in a bottom-up sense, price it sustainably in a way that you understand your costs and margins. And sometimes in tech, that's actually quite difficult. Being able to price it at a unit basis when you've got large-scale infrastructure you need to set up. And being able to do it that way. But just the final point that I make about pricing is that anchoring is real. So if you price something early to a large part of your market, trying to trying to increase the price later on without pricing power or being able to add significant value is incredibly hard. So that's it.
Okay. Bronwyn or Sam, any comments about commercializing on what to charge?
I've had bandwidth issues, Robert, as you know. I think hopefully my static image wasn't too embarrassing. So it depends. Are we talking about pricing of digital health solutions, health technology solutions in general? I've got a few thoughts on that, just in general. I've been in med devices and diagnostics for a very, very long time. And one thing that I've noticed is, a return on investment, you probably spend about 20% of your time and your money in the R&D space and then 80% in the commercialization space. And often the focus is sort of around the other way. And one of the things I've noticed, obviously, with digital health, with a classic sort of medical device, what you do is you demonstrate that the thing works, right? It performs well. And then what happens is you go about commercializing it. With digital health solutions, it's really interesting, right? Because often what happens is your business model is being proven out when you're actually proving out performance, right? Which is a really interesting piece. And some people might see that as high risk and high uncertainty, but I actually see that as a positive. It's a really great opportunity. And as Marcus is saying, it's a really good opportunity for you to then perfect your business model for, understand exactly what pricing is going to give impact. And then as you start to build up that intelligence, then you can start to make bigger and bigger investments.
Yep. Bronwyn?
I just really want to reiterate one thing, which I've not actually ever heard anyone say in a panel. So that's always cool because, as you say, I tend to spend an alarming amount of time on them. But Marcus, your point about anchoring is just so on point. I mean, the amount of small companies and early stage companies and early revenue companies we see pricing, not necessarily just customer contracts, but pilots in a way that is unsustainable, and then basically almost it becomes suicidal in that if you do a wholesale pilot and you price it at a cost that you can't kind of keep yourself alive on, trying to then up the price later and say we're no longer in pilot stage unless it's in that original pilot contract is incredibly difficult. So, the desperation to get the data, get the pilot, get the customer testimonials and the traction and stuff to drive investment. If you do that in a way that, as Marcus said, if you haven't anchored your price, that's what you're going to be tied to forever. But you did it for 10,000 patients for this. Why do you want, this bigger number? It's critical. And so many companies we see come out of all these pilots, and then the customers just go, "Oh, it was worth it at $3 a patient. It's not worth it at $10 a patient." Or we haven't budgeted for $10 a patient.
And that's not a general health tech problem. That's tech worldwide, right? Yeah. Anchoring is a problem.
Pilot and death by pilot in this space, very, very real issue.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for that. Sam, we got you pretty good on broadband for right now, so I'll circle back to your question here. For Australian companies that want to take a more global perspective to commercializing, what would you suggest as some first steps to dip your toe into other countries and other markets?
Good question. And I'll maybe take a philosophical view just a bit there in terms of that anchoring discussion too. I think one of the things that I'd suggest, and it sort of links back to the first question, is often you don't know what you don't know. And so that whole concept of idea, build it, and then invest in the commercial success, that sort of continuum, I just don't prescribe to that at all. And I think market-led innovation from a global perspective is all about knowing everything that you can know about the market. And I think Marcus said that right back at the start when I was just going off broadband. And so for me, when you want to have a global perspective, you have to get as much intelligence as possible. That means, talking to your network, talking to key opinion leaders, talking to channel partners, strategic partners, their business development, corp dev people, customers, payers, etc., and try and get as much information as you can. And then as you presumably, you've already got a solution in mind, it's working locally. And then what you're doing is you're then going out to show that it's got broader applicability outside of Australia. And so I'm very big in trying to understand everything that you can understand about, your product and how it's going to fit into those markets. And then you have to invest. And I've been in the situation where I've invested in a market in advance of actually knowing the market dynamics. And trust me, it's a pretty expensive exercise.
Yeah. Follow-up for Bronwyn or Dr. Marcus?
I just think, so we just did a partnership for the companies that we work with Anthem in the US, which is the second largest HMO. And one of the big tenets of that partnership is we get to nominate Australian companies into their digital incubator. But the bigger piece for me is about sharing educational resources and getting access to people from inside that payer to mentor and give advice to companies because they're inside the US payment system. So there's a lot of people who work as advisors in the space, whether digital health or medtech. I'm not really kind of splitting hairs here. But I don't think any kind of service provider or consultant or advisor will ever really take the place of hearing from someone who's in it, whether it's big pharma, big payer, insurance or whatever. I think getting that voice of the actual payer, not what somebody thinks the payer thinks, is really, really important, especially when you're going into international markets, because reimbursement pathways are different. The way things are paid for is different. The way clinicians are incentivized is different. So, having that deep understanding in every jurisdiction. What we do see is that there's no one business model in digital health. The companies that we see successful in penetrating multiple markets, and I know Marcus is on this journey, is the business model and the pricing model you might have in Australia might be completely and utterly different. And your paying customer might be completely and utterly different in the US or the UK or Germany or France or Asian markets. So I do think that, to that point, you really have to get the voice of the actual customer in international markets. And I also just think the other thing is that we're all a little bit giddy about specific markets. So there's always a market of preference in kind of the international investment scenario, whether it's the UK or whether it's Europe or whether it's the US, and the US is the one that kind of takes up the most airtime, and it is a critical market. But you can build a really big company without necessarily going to the US. It is one of 8 major markets across the world. So, and sometimes the solutions we see are really just not suited to the US market. Like they're much more suited to a UK single payer market or a European market. So I just think when you're going internationally, you really need to find that fit, and then you really need to talk to people in the market themselves versus just getting advisors and commissioning reports.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Marcus, I've got one for you. Since you've got a little bit of background on this one. I've seen that there's been increased interest in digital health, at least from investors and VCs. But the expectations aren't quite the same for healthcare, because it can be a much longer time frame before you get an ROI or a buyback for your stocks. So as a founder, how do you go about managing those expectations with investors that are less familiar with healthcare and kind of get them to understand the difference in returns and turnaround time seen in health?
Yeah, it's hard. So I think for those who aren't familiar with Health Engine and how we've been funded over time, and we're a venture capital backed business, and our shareholder register is basically made up of either global VC in groups like Sequoia or corporate VC like Telstra Ventures, Seven West, and also a whole bunch of family offices and high net worth individuals. So I think that gives you a sense as to the investment environment, I guess, for health tech. Where I think the management of these sorts of guys are, let's be really clear, right? Health tech, I think most people understand who are working in it, takes longer, costs more, and it's just so complex. And I think for me, being able to find patient capital and patient capital really resides in sort of 2 big pots, right? The first pot is really around finding strategic players who understand healthcare and see some value that you can add over time. It's not just a financial play. It's not about ROI on a very short liquidity window that they want to do a quick sort of flip. It's about sort of understanding where the value is over time, and they can see that. So the strategic players, whether that's corporates or pharma or insurers or whatever, they're actually obviously a big potential source of patient capital that you might want to tap into. The second group would be philanthropic organizations, or organizations that actually see the value of healthcare being improved without necessarily seeing a financial return. So whether it's social impact, and there are lots of organizations like this, whether it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a bunch of the Mayo Clinic, who whilst they don't they do clinical stuff, they do a lot of research-based stuff. There's a lot of these sorts of foundations that have been set up with large endowments that are happy to invest. And sure, ROI is important financially, but they're actually much more philanthropic in the way that they're looking at stuff. Pure financial investors with no idea about healthcare need to be educated, I guess, in this whole long fuse, big bang aspect of healthcare, and they need to understand the story and be willing to come along the journey with you. If you don't have that, and it's hard, you're going to get a lot of pressure that is unwanted and unwarranted, because there's not a lot you can do about it. So, pick your investors wisely is my thing, so you don't have to manage them too much later on. It's not as easy as it sounds, because it's not easy to attract. So.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we've got time for about 2 more questions here with this session. So,
hey, Robert, can I just jump in on there, because I've actually been a see.
Yeah, please. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I had one that's kind of similar.
It's a really interesting space, right? And Marcus, your register is kind of interesting. It has some players that haven't really played in health before. But I do think, to Marcus's point, finding the right investors, and Marcus, I'm going to plagiarise long fuse, big bang in future. But every investor I know says that they can do healthcare. So any generalist check, everyone says they can do healthcare. It might be regulated, but it's the same as other regulated sectors. The reality is, if you speak to founders, especially at international level, and you say, do you want a tech investor or a healthcare investor? They will always say a healthcare investor, because of the complexity of the payment market and the knowledge. Most of our healthcare funds, Brandon Capital, Bioscience Managers, One Ventures that manage the BTF funds, they can often hold their investments for 8 years and never see a cent of revenue. So they have a completely different approach to how they invest to a tech investor, how they value technology to a tech investor, because revenue doesn't often come to play in a medical device or drug development space. So I do think that picking your right investor is good, because I think everyone will say that they can support a healthcare company, but can they really? And the second piece is, everybody says that they're investing and they have funds, but check that the investors actually have funds, dry powder, what we call dry powder, to invest before you spend a lot of time cultivating them. There's a lot of people out there that say they have funds that don't actually have anything that's free for investment.
It's very, very, very true. Sam, I've got one for you. I think since COVID, we've seen a massive impact on healthcare industries as a whole. Often it targets elective surgeries, consultations, some of the top revenue streams that usually our acute aged care GP practices are used to have kind of really been hit. So have you seen major shifts globally, and have you had to change your sales strategy now that we're kind of past that point? Is there anything that you've had to do differently to sell into these healthcare spaces with your solution?
Yeah, I'm going to get into the specifics of us, right? Because obviously my lived experience is in diagnostics a lot. So if you can imagine COVID in diagnostics, it's been quite a significant cathartic sort of event. There's probably been two things. One, especially in the rapid diagnostics point of care space, people are rethinking about how they get those types of solutions delivered to them. So, I would never have thought in my lifetime that we'd be talking about over-the-counter sort of diagnostic testing in the manner that people are talking about it now, right? So I guess in some respects it's been completely accelerated. The industry viewers has been completely accelerated. People are just being forced to think differently, which I think is a great thing. The investor side is really interesting too, right? Because I think the appetite that we're all being exposed to is quite positive towards healthcare. And, I'm working with bankers at the moment alongside Bron to bring a company to market in the near future. And they keep telling us about how, the IPO market's a bit soft and stuff like that. And then I have to keep reminding them, healthcare's not. Bankers will always try and get they make their job a little bit easier, right? But I think the people are starting to understand how important healthcare solutions are for all of us, in terms of wellness and well-being and lifestyle and all of those sort of things, and we keep people safe. So I think it's great that people are actually starting to really think about sort of much more sort of strategic sort of investment plays, and healthcare is a great segment to be in.
Sure. And Bronwyn and Dr. Marcus, follow up to you guys. Have you seen any impacts to the sales cycle from post-COVID to some of the industry things that you're trying to get established?
Yeah. Look, I mean, on our side, I think what we're finding is it's a bit mixed. Obviously, one of the big revenue pools in healthcare is the provider, and unfortunately, providers have been hit quite badly with COVID. They're actually not necessarily looking for new tools, because the last thing they need is having to learn new systems and other things. So they're really kind of putting a lot of these new types of investments on hold, even though some of these tools can help. The complexity of what they're dealing with, is real, and they have provided feedback around it. When everything settles down, then we'll talk to you about tech. But it's kind of this chicken and egg problem where tech can help. They don't want to learn it. So the switching cost and the migration to new tech is hard.
Fair enough. And Bronwyn?
I think the whole environment's changing, and I think one of the really big challenges is just how quickly everything's changing. So to Sam's point, if you commissioned market research in early 2020 and that was driving your strategy, there's a very good chance that all of those stakeholders may feel very differently about the problem that you did that market research on today than they did a year ago. And so, normally 1-year-old research is good for a few more years in terms of driving a business strategy. And Sam's laughing because we have this problem with some research.
We did exactly that.
It's a year old. It's like, but it's obsolete. And they're like, it's only a year old. But, the environment has changed so quickly and it's still changing. And so we had we were chatting to some US folks about, the massive uptake in telehealth and all the rest of it. And that's all starting to taper off, but it's staying high in certain verticals, and the main one being behavioural health. So I think what's really interesting now is we're not really going to know what the market's going to look like until probably vaccination, so over the next 12 months. So it's an extremely exciting time in terms of catalysing uptake and overcoming some barriers to adoption. And it's an extremely challenging time in that you don't know what next months or years market's going to look like. The emergency use authorities being issued by the FDA, there's thousands of them. And, what happens beyond, once vaccination's widespread, what happens to the EUAs and that door gets closed, what happens to those companies? There is a whole bunch of issues around coming out of this that are not going to be simple and straightforward to navigate, and are probably going to rely on, back to the investment conversation, people who have some really patient investors who are going to understand that the kind of the rush is over and that things need to settle down a little bit. And so there's going to be some interesting tensions, I think, in the next 12 to 18 months.
Absolutely.
Robert, can I jump in just one point about the investment piece as well? Because our company is an investor as well as obviously a company taking products to market, etc. And one of the things that I've noticed is that how CEOs and their management team deal with ambiguity and the stuff that Bron's just brought up as problems really does say a lot about how the company is going to perform in good times and bad, right? So I'm always looking for, really coachable or people that aren't necessarily wedded to, the way that market is today, right? And that sort of drives our investment thesis often is around the team piece.
Very, very. I think that's about all the time we've got. So, Peter, I think I'm on time.
Yeah, you are. But there was a really interesting question there from Jackie, and I know we've talked a little bit about some of these points as well. I know I have with Jackie within the community forum. But I'll summarize her question, which is there for those that haven't seen it. Basically, around building a business model for health tech solutions in lower income countries where the market needs quite different to Australia. So we're thinking Africa specifically, where typically funding might come from NGOs or from other kind of public health services where the infrastructure is not there, or NGO funding is really kind of variable. Have you had any experience or thoughts around, taking on something that's like a super important challenge around healthcare when looking at a global perspective in these areas that probably need the most investment, are the hardest to solve from across from here? So has anyone got any thoughts around it before we wrap up? Or is it a good one just to think about? We can do that.
In New Zealand, I think it's Ray Avery is a massive medtech inventor who does do a lot for, tries to develop products for use in developing nations. And they've been exploring different philanthropic kind of venture vehicles in order to do that. I think the reality is, at a commercial level, they are harder markets to penetrate. I do think places like, to Marcus's point, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and various global NGOs offer some good access to that. And I guess the flip side is, as does being profitable enough to have a line of your business that is dedicated to social enterprise that operates alongside your for-profit business that goes to more developed markets. But it's a massive problem. I do think there's different types of funds in that space and different types of philanthropic structures, but I'm going to say it's not easy. And as a former / non-practicing venture capitalist, it's probably not a space I spend much time in either.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of solutions in that are targeting space, just like Bron said, in the New Zealand example, Tomo in diagnostics, looking at HIV testing, and they spent a lot of time in Africa actually understanding the use case and understanding the design that was required to make that work really, really well. So from a product solution perspective, that was perfectly targeted. I think the issue is who do you actually partner with to get through, all of the issues around fraud, corruption, how the governments operate, all of those sort of things. And that's the reason why people tend to work with NGOs and, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So, yeah.
Great one. Well, thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Bronwyn and Robert, for this awesome conversation. I feel like I need, like, this is so great about these sessions, but we're doing it in a whole day. I feel like I need to lie down after all of the truth bombs and really interesting information that comes out of it. We've just got to push on to the next session, because it's great to have such valuable insights from all of you. So thank you so much for joining.